Not every night on the road is uneventful, but I'd always thought mine were usually quiet. I've been driving for rideshare services for years, sticking to the late hours when the roads are nearly empty, and I've grown accustomed to the routine. Most nights it's just me, my aging sedan, and the steady hum of the engine as I ferry strangers to their destinations. I considered myself a careful driver, one who trusted his instincts above all. Yet there are moments that defy routine, nights when something inexplicable happens that leaves you questioning the very fabric of everyday life. I recall one such night with unsettling clarity. It was a cold, clear evening in late autumn. The clock had barely struck 1:45 a.m. when a new ride request popped up on my app. The pickup was at an address I didn't immediately recognize, a nondescript location on the outskirts of town near a cluster of old abandoned warehouses. I hesitated for a moment, a subtle prickling at the back of my mind, but I shrugged it off as just another late-night fare. After all, I'd experienced plenty of oddities over the years. I wasn't about to let a little apprehension stop me. Pulling up to the designated address, I found the area unusually quiet. The only light came from a few sporadic street lamps that cast long, wavering shadows across cracked asphalt and patches of overgrown weeds. In front of one of the dark, shuttered warehouses, I saw him, a solitary figure standing beneath a flickering lamp. He was tall and lean, clad in a worn leather jacket that had clearly seen better days. His face was partly hidden by the deep shadow of his hood, and although I couldn't make out all his features, his eyes, glinting briefly in the weak light, seemed to scan his surroundings with a restless vigilance. I parked a safe distance away and observed him for a moment. There was something distinctly off about his demeanor. His movements were measured, almost mechanical, and he didn't appear eager or nervous. He simply existed in that space as though he belonged. When I unlocked the car door and said, "Evening," he stepped forward without a word and slid into the back seat. His silence was disconcerting, and I immediately felt a tension I couldn't quite shake off. I settled into the driver's seat, started the engine and merged back onto the road, stealing occasional glances at him in the rearview mirror. For the first few miles, the ride passed in an oppressive silence. The only sounds were the soft whir of the tires on the wet road and the hum of my car's engine. I couldn't help but wonder if I should have canceled the ride. Then, in a low, measured tone that was almost casual, he spoke. "Ever wonder if you've ever picked up someone you shouldn't have?" The question wasn't posed as a mere conversation starter. It came off as a statement of fact, delivered with an unsettling calm that made my skin crawl. "I try to be careful," I replied, my voice even as I kept my eyes on the road. His tone didn't invite further discussion, and though I wanted to ask him what he meant, I didn't. Instead, I focused on driving. Every so often I caught his gaze in the mirror, those eyes, emotionless and steady, scrutinizing me as if I were the subject of some quiet experiment. The route he provided was unfamiliar. I soon found myself driving through neighborhoods I rarely visited, areas where streetlights were sparse, and the pavement seemed to whisper of forgotten stories. Every detail, the rusted chain-link fences, the broken street lamps, the abandoned storefronts, suddenly took on an ominous tone. The dashboard clock read 2:15 a.m., and the solitude of the night amplified even the smallest sound. A distant siren, the murmur of a passing car, the gentle thud of my own heartbeat. After about 10 minutes, the silence was broken again. "I used to drive for another service," he said, his voice as even as before. "But I quit after too many nights like these. Nights when I realized that trust can be dangerous." He offered no further explanation, and I didn't press him for details. His words were matter of fact, as if he were reciting a known truth rather than sharing his own experience. I couldn't tell if he was bitter or merely resigned to fate. The road ahead was dark and winding. I drove along a long, deserted stretch that felt as if it might swallow you whole. Every now and then, the occasional creak of my car's suspension reminded me that even the most reliable machine had its limits. I found myself replaying his earlier question in my mind. Had I really picked up someone I shouldn't have? The thought nagged at me, persistent yet inexplicable, like a quiet warning that I couldn't ignore. Then we reached a fork in the road, a point where the GPS indicated we should take a turn. I slowed in preparation, when suddenly his voice cut through the silence. "You missed the turn," he stated flatly. I glanced at the navigation screen and confirmed that I was indeed on the correct route. "We're on track," I replied calmly, though inside I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. His eyes met mine in the mirror for a fleeting second, and I thought I saw a hint of something. Disappointment, perhaps, or a silent admonition. "Trust your instincts," he added, as if offering advice on navigating not just the road, but life itself. I tried to steer the conversation back to neutral ground, but the rest of the ride was marked by the same measured silence and the sound of tires rolling on pavement. Every mile deepened the sense of unease, and I began to wonder if this encounter was more than a mere oddity, a deliberate crossing of paths meant to impart a warning. I'd heard stories from other drivers about inexplicable incidents on quiet nights, but nothing had prepared me for the calm, direct nature of his remarks. Eventually, we approached a dilapidated building on the edge of a quiet residential area. The street was nearly empty, lit only by a single dim street lamp, whose feeble glow barely reached the cracked pavement. "This is your stop," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I pulled over and waited, expecting him to exit immediately. Instead, he sat quietly for several moments, his gaze fixed on the interior of the car as if lost in thought. Then, as if following a slow, predetermined ritual, he unlatched the door and stepped out into the night. I watched him disappear into the shadows, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness until he was gone. There was no dramatic farewell, no nod, no wave, just a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat there for several minutes, my mind churning over the events of the ride. The encounter felt surreal, a simple matter-of-fact ride that had somehow carried with it a warning I couldn't ignore. After regaining my composure, I restarted the engine and began the drive back to a more populated area. As I merged onto better lit streets, I couldn't help but replay the encounter over and over in my mind. The passenger's cryptic remarks, his unflinching stare, and the direct, almost clinical way he delivered his words left a lingering impression. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see him sitting there again, silently watching, as if to remind me of his cautionary message. The next morning, while nursing a cup of coffee at a quiet diner before my first ride, I came across a local news article on my phone. The piece reported a series of robberies in the area where I had dropped off the mysterious passenger. The suspect was described as a gaunt man with an unyielding stare and a detached manner, details that sent a chill through me. The report noted that he had been seen near several abandoned buildings on nights much like the one I had experienced, each time appearing as if he were waiting for something or someone. Reading that article confirmed what I had suspected all along. My encounter wasn't just an odd ride, it was a warning. In that brief journey, I had come face to face with a presence that defied the normal expectations of a routine shift. It was as if fate had arranged for me to pick up a harbinger of something dark, a silent messenger whose very existence was meant to remind me that trust, especially in the dead of night, is a fragile thing.